Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Telespark and the Inspiration Stage. Thank you very much for joining us on this Sunday for something that is very special and unusual here at Telespark. We're all about science. It's not often we get to be about a lot of the biological sciences, but today we have Dr. Sandie Black joining us to speak about narwhals. And this is part of an online course that the Vancouver Aquarium offers on Arctic marine life. I will tell you a bit more about that in just a moment, but to introduce the course overall, Canada is an Arctic nation, yet only a small percentage of Canadians actually live in the Arctic. How do people living in southern parts of Canada, or anywhere else in the world for that matter, learn about the unique and fascinating marine animals that inhabit this enigmatic environment? Allow me to present the online Arctic Marine Life course. This course is supported by the Science in Canada's North Café Scientifique series, and we would also like to acknowledge the support of the W. Garfield Weston Foundation and the Canadian Association of Science Centres for their support. Our partners include the Alliance of Natural History Museums of Canada, Canada's Accredited Zoos and Aquariums, Telespark in Calgary, Canadian Museum of Nature in Ottawa, and the Discovery Centre in Halifax. To learn more about other dates and locations of talks as part of this series, you can visit the Vancouver Aquarium website, and I have a few flyers down here at the front that you could take with you as well to get the URL. If you miss a presentation, this is also being recorded, as are the other presentations, to be made available online on the Vancouver Aquarium's YouTube channel. And if you have any questions about the course itself and how to register for the course after it has begun, it did begin on October 28th, but it's still possible to register and take the certification part of it as well. You can contact the Vancouver Aquarium. So, I didn't introduce myself. My name is Maya Graham. I'm in charge of distance learning at Telespark. So we do have students that are joining us online as part of the Vancouver Aquarium's online course. And you are here joining us in person to listen to Dr. Sandie Black and be able to ask her questions as well. So Dr. Sandie Black is head of veterinary services at the Calgary Zoo. She's clinical associate professor at the University of Calgary School of Veterinary Medicine. And she is speaking to us today on the elusive narwhal, the biology and current research of Canada's unicorn. She's a narwhal researcher in her spare time. She's worked with Fisheries and Oceans Canada for the past 11 years in summer research camps where narwhal are handled for satellite transmitter placement. Her primary responsibilities in camp are to monitor the health and welfare of the narwhal as they're being handled, to assist in training personnel in the capture and handling techniques, and to capture biological samples. Her research is centered around assessing the capture stress and recovery, as well as looking for measures of population health and stress. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Sandie Black.
Thank you, Maya. Well, it's my great pleasure to talk to you this afternoon about the narwhal. In a life spent working with animals and living with animals, narwhal are among my all-time favorites. So I hope to share some of that passion with you this afternoon. And I would say good afternoon. If we were in the Arctic, I might say unakut, which would be how we would say good afternoon in Inuktitut. And we'll talk about the people of the Arctic as we go through this presentation, because they are very closely linked with the narwhal. So narwhal, how often do you get to study an animal whose natural history is so closely linked with fantasy? And certainly many of the relics around the world that are known as unicorn horns actually did come from narwhal. The Viking people that traded in these horns for many, many years kept very quiet, actually probably for centuries, kept very quiet about where the horns were coming from because they fetched such a high price as unicorn horns. Unicorn horns were believed to have great powers. If you used the base of the horn to make a cup, and the base of the horn would be about as big around as your forearm, or the base of the tusk in a large narwhal, they would make cups from those and drink from them. And it was thought that they could neutralize any poison, so that if you used a narwhal horn or a piece of narwhal horn, you would be completely safe from being poisoned. Narwhal horn was also believed to bring great vitality and virility, and thereby preceding many of our more modern drugs like Viagra as having a lot of use in the marketplace. This is a picture by Pierre Pommet, who was writing about the drugs available in the late 18th century, which was when people started to realize that there actually was a creature, not a land-based unicorn, but a sea-based unicorn. Although, as you can see from this picture, Pierre really didn't understand yet what the creature was. His top animal looks quite a bit like a reptile, the bottom one like a fish. But one thing he has right in the bottom picture is the fact that this tusk, or tooth, comes through the bottom lip of the narwhal. It was around this time that Carl Linnaeus, who is the father of the way that we name all living creatures now, named the narwhal and named it monodon, which means one tooth, monoceros, which means one tusk or one horn. So I think Linnaeus was hedging his bets. Nobody really knew what the tusk or horn was yet, what part of the body it represented. At this time, narwhal tusk material fetched about 10 times its weight in value in gold. So it was very, very valuable. And it was used in many places around the world. This is the royal throne in Copenhagen in Denmark, and you can see that much of this throne is constructed from pieces of narwhal horn. The famous scepter of the Habsburg family in Germany was also created from a narwhal tooth. And right up to the modern day, there's a huge fascination with narwhals. You can buy a stout beer, Narwhal Imperial Stout from the Sierra Nevada Brewery. I have one of these Avenging Narwhal sets in my office that somebody kindly gave me. A narwhal that, through a somewhat convoluted story on the back of the box, is angry with the seals that live in its neck of the woods in the world, and also, strangely, penguins, which live on the opposite pole, and koalas, which come from Australia. And on the bottom, if you have never gone on YouTube and looked for the narwhal song, and you can just type in, I'm sure if you just type in narwhal, it will be the first hit. You can listen to a very lovely song that will tell you why narwhal are so awesome. The IUCN is an organization that lists, has criteria for listing living creatures around the world, plants and animals, and how threatened or what their conservation needs are. For many, many years, narwhal were listed as something called data deficient, meaning we didn't know enough to say how endangered or not they were on our planet. They're now listed as near threatened. We have a lot more information in the last couple of decades about how many narwhal there are, but they are very difficult to count. First of all, they're animals that live in water. They live in water that's very far north. They live far offshore for a lot of the year, and during the part of the year where they're offshore, it's dark 24 hours a day. So there's a lot of error and also peril in counting this animal. But we now know worldwide there's somewhere in the order of about 80,000 narwhal. And 70,000 of those live in the Canadian high Arctic. So this really is very strongly a Canadian animal. We do share it with other countries around the world. So the primary population, this is Baffin Island. If you sort of orient yourself, here's Canada, Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. Here's Alaska. This is Baffin Island, and the largest population of narwhal live in between Baffin Island and Greenland in an area called Davis Strait. There's a smaller population that lives down here in the north part of Hudson's Bay. There's a small population on the west coast of Greenland and on the east coast of Greenland and around Svalbard. And these animals might range well over into the northern parts of Russia. But again, all these other populations together probably number about 10,000 animals, and that large 70,000 animals lives here along the north coast of Baffin Island and Davis Strait. The narwhal is what we call a medium-sized toothed whale. So they're considerably smaller than a sperm whale, but quite a bit bigger than probably the most common toothed whale that people know of, the bottlenose dolphin. They are somewhat tubby looking. They don't look really athletic when you think about something like a bottlenose dolphin, but in fact they are incredible athletes, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. They do have a tusk. This is a tooth, and we'll talk more about the tooth, but it is a tooth that most of the time erupts in males. Their skin is a mottled color, and we'll have a close-up of a skin in a bit, but you can see from these pictures the mottling of black spots on a gray background. they have a very short pectoral fin that actually turns up at the end. So you can see they're a little bit of a turned up fin. And as well, the end of their tail flukes is quite convex in shape. And again, that's a little bit different than some of the other toothed whales. Length, males are as long as 4.7 meters. So a very tall man is about 2 meters, so these guys are twice as long. And I'll show you a picture that shows you a relative scale of a person to a narwhal. The female's about 4 meters long. Males can weigh as much as 1,600 kilograms, which is about a metric ton and a half. A female's about 900 kilograms, so about a metric ton. Age at maturity, somewhere between 4 and 7 years. It depends a little bit on their size and how well they've been able to grow and feed. Lifespan, we think somewhere in the order of 50 years, but they could certainly live a lot longer than that. Gestation length is 14 or 15 months. So a human baby takes 9 months to grow, a narwhal baby about 14 or 15 months. Narwhal, the name narwhal comes from the Norwegian. We think that the origin is the word nar, which actually means corpse. Apparently, if you drown and you wash up on shore a few days later, your skin looks quite mottled, sort of blue and white. And so this modeling of the skin of a narwhal that you can see on the left here reminded sailors of what a drowned corpse would look like. So not a very inspiring name, if you will. There is another word in Old Germanic, narwa, which means narrow. So some people think this might refer to the narrowness of that tooth or tusk that extends beyond. Now, like a lot of words in Inuktitut, there are several ways that they describe a narwhal. So there's a word for a female narwhal with a calf. There's a word for a narwhal calf. But the most common one that's used is tugalik, which basically just means having a tusk. Tuga means tusk. In this picture, you can see males doing something called a tusking behavior, where they push their tusks out of the water and wave them about. But if you watch them carefully, they very, very rarely touch each other. They're very careful with those tusks. So here's a picture of a human diver next to a shape of a narwhal that gives you a bit of an impression of how big these animals are. Now, you'll notice that they have no dorsal fin. Something like a bottlenose dolphin or a killer whale has a large fin that extends up over the back. But if you're a whale that lives a lot of the time in and under the ice pack, a dorsal fin would really be a liability. And so they have a bit of a ridge on their back, and we'll see that in some of the pictures to come, but no fin. And it makes them very well adapted for life in and around ice packs. So this is a video that was taken this summer in a place called Stornsfjord on Ellesmere Island. And this is a pod of narwhal swimming by. You'll be able to see some of the mottling on their back. And if you watch carefully, the smaller gray-brown ones are fairly newborn babies. Just have to catch up to them when they come out of the water again. And there's the pod moving off. And this is often what you see when you're watching narwhal, is just the front of their melon or head, the blowhole as it comes out of the water, and part of their back. So narwhal have no teeth except the one that extrudes through their upper lip as a tusk. The narwhal looking at us, if you can think about him grinning, I always think about this as a toothless grin. If we look at fetal narwhal before they are born, there are some embryonic teeth in both their upper and lower jaw, but the only tooth that develops in adulthood is one on either side of their upper jaw. Generally, in males, the one on the right stays embedded in the jaw and never, ever erupts. And the left one erupts right through the lip and starts to grow. So this is a baby tusk, one that's just starting to grow in a young male, probably a 1 or 2 year old male. Often, as you see in this picture, the tip of the tusk is quite polished as they use it to, we believe, potentially stir up sediments on the bottom looking for food. The rest of the tusk will be covered with a reddish or a greenish algae. So you can see this staining. This guy needs to brush his teeth a little bit, the staining of the brown material on the tusk. And again, it's not coming out his mouth, it's coming right through the lip, almost a piercing that has it grow out through the lip. This will grow throughout the life of the male to lengths considerably longer than 2 meters, so again, taller than a very tall man. And it grows out and spirals. Like the typical picture of a unicorn horn, it spirals, and almost always, there's only been a couple of reports of tusks that spiral otherwise than to the left. And even if the right tooth grows out, and it does in a very small percentage of males, they will erupt both tusks and be what's called a double tusker. Even that right one still tends to spiral to the left. About 5% of females will erupt a tusk. So just because you see a tusk doesn't mean for sure that that's a boy. Some of the female whales will erupt a tusk, but most of them do not. And here's a picture of a skull of a male that had 2 very large tusks. Generally, one is smaller than the other. Generally, the right tusk is smaller than the left. Now, the tusk, it's been a fascination of humans for centuries. It continues in that way, and there's quite a bit of controversy over what that tusk is for. So at times people have said, well, perhaps it's for spearing food, and that, while it makes a nice story, there's no way for a narwhal to get something off its tusk once it's speared it. It's just got these little tiny flippers, and I think it would be quite frustrating to have something stuck on your tusk that you couldn't get at. It's been thought as something that they would use for defense or for fighting with other males. But again, when we see males interacting, their tusks do not touch each other. The tusk, we find, is very, very sensitive, and it is a tooth. So if you can think about, if you have a sensitive tooth, a tooth that's cracked or has some kind of injury to it, and you drink something very cold and or very hot, that tooth is very sensitive to that. And similarly, the muskox tooth, the tusk that comes out through their lip, is very, very sensitive. It has no enamel on it. It doesn't have the hard surface that we have on our teeth. It simply is covered with dentin that is full of tiny microtubules, microscopic tubules, that may carry messages in the form of molecules into the inner part of the tusk. The inner part is cementum, and then in younger males there is a very large blood and nerve cord that runs up in the middle of that tooth. It's not uncommon for narwhal to have a broken tusk. When that happens, generally the end will plug with dentin. So Martin Nguyen is a dentist from the United States. He does some teaching at Harvard, and he's been studying the tusk for a number of years. His idea is that the narwhal may use this tusk for sensing things in their environment that are important to know. And one of the things that would be very important is how much salt is in the water. Interestingly, when ice forms, ice is fresh water, even though it forms out of a saltwater ocean. So when ice is forming, the amount of salt left behind goes up in the water as fresh water is pulled out of that salt water. And so a signal to a whale might be if the level of salt is going up in the water around it, that means freezing is starting to happen, and they might want to move to an area that is not in danger of freezing over top of them. Remember, narwhal are whales, they're mammals, they breathe air like us, and they need access to that air all the time. What Dr. Nguyen has found is that narwhals react when their tusk is exposed to high saline or high salt solutions. He created a container that goes around the tusk, and when he puts in a solution with higher levels of salt, the narwhal will shake its head, doesn't seem to like that, and their heart rate goes up a little bit. So this is still a theory. It's not proven 100%, but it certainly is interesting to think that that tooth may help the narwhal survive in their environment. Now, Canada's Inuit people are very closely tied in many communities to the narwhal. It is a very important part of their culture. And something that they've coexisted with for many, many centuries. Much the way that we might look forward to the first robin arriving in the spring, Inuit will look forward to the narwhal returning in the late spring and early summer to their communities. And they watch for them, they love to watch them, and they also hunt them. It is one of the sources of food in these communities. So narwhal are harvested. They are co-managed in these community hunts by the Hunter and Trapper organization from the community, as well as Canada's Department of Fisheries and Oceans. So each community has a quota and a tag system for collecting the narwhal. The tusks are carved or sold, and the muktuk, the skin, is a delicacy and a very important food security contributor for the Inuit communities. Muktuk is very rich in vitamin C, something that's difficult to get when you live in an area where there's very little plant food that is edible. And so this is a very important cultural and food item for the Inuit. And I just want to point out in this picture where this child and his father are standing is something called the flow edge. This is the melting edge of ice in the springtime. They will go right out to the edge of the ice in snowmobiles or dog sleds and hunt from that melting edge of the ice. But just imagine being out on basically open ocean, standing at the melting edge of the ice with ocean in front of you. So you can imagine that sometimes it is dangerous to be there, but that is a very important place both for the Inuit and the narwhal. So we'll talk about what happens through the year for narwhal. Spring is for lovers. In March, April, early May, narwhal are breeding. They are out in the deep ocean at this point, moving towards land. The largest cover on the ocean is still ice at this point rather than open water, and they are looking for a mate. The drawing here was actually drawn by William Scoresby, who is a famous British Arctic explorer, and one of the first people to describe the narwhal in an accurate way at a time when larger ships were being used to get into the Arctic, and they were successful in getting through what was called the middle pack and into some of the more northern waters where narwhal were very, very plentiful. Narwhal live between 70 and 80 degrees north, and that is incredibly far north, and it took sort of Western Europeans quite a long time before they were easily able to get up there, a lot of the times looking for the Northwest Passage, an elusive sea passage to the west. And you can see again in the picture, the underside of the narwhal, there's a line or a slit, and that's their genital opening. So nothing on the outside, they just have a little slit, and all of their external reproductive organs are tucked within. Come June, the narwhal are moving to those flow edges and towards the fjords along the north edge of Baffin Island and some of the other high Arctic islands. So at the flow edge, it's a very important feeding place for them. In the wintertime, when they're out in the deep water, they're doing very deep dives. Narwhal can dive upwards of 2 kilometers into the ocean, so that's 2 kilometers straight down looking for food. And in the deep winter, they may be feeding largely on squid, sometimes Greenland halibut in shallower areas, but shallow for a narwhal is still probably 100 meters of depth. And then they move to the flow edge, so that melting edge of ice where you get huge accumulations of a tiny fish called Arctic cod and smaller zooplankton organisms called krill. And it's a very rich feeding area. So there'll be narwhal there. There will be other creatures that are looking for narwhal or also for the Arctic cod. Seabirds and polar bears, sometimes Arctic foxes come to feed there. Greenland shark come to feed there. And so it's a very, very rich opportunity for feeding. Once that melting edge has completed its summer melt and there's a lot of open water, they will move into deep water fjords. But they're always staying in what is quite deep water, even when they're close to shore. When they're in these fjords, the pregnant females will deliver their calves. And like most whales, they deliver them tail first. So when you're an air-breathing animal being born underwater, you don't want to have your head come out and be starting to breathe on your own at the beginning of being born. You want that to happen at the end of being born. So this is backwards to the way most mammals are born. Most mammals are born head first. So the females are giving birth in these deep fjords. This is where they're lactating. It's a relatively safe place for them, but it's not entirely safe at that time of year. So there are a few things that prey on narwhal or opportunistically look for narwhal, and one of them is the Greenland shark. Now this is a video that was taken this summer of a shark that was tagged in the research camp that I was in. Greenland shark is called somniosus, which means sleepy or sleeper, microcephalus, which means tiny head. Although when I look at this guy, I don't think his head is that tiny. So this shark is just being released. They are very slow in their movement. So this is a normal speed for a Greenland shark, but they're a little bit like the tortoise and the rabbit. We did find out from tagging these animals that even though they're moving slowly, they are moving constantly, and in the space of a week, they can move several hundred kilometers. So they are one of the predators of narwhal, somewhat opportunistically. They certainly could not catch a healthy narwhal, but they are often found in the same vicinity as narwhal when narwhal are feeding. Polar bears may opportunistically leap off ice or off the shoreline to attack narwhal, but one of their largest predators now is the killer whale, and we'll talk a little bit more about the killer whale when we talk about threats. The other thing that narwhal are doing in the fjords in the summertime is socializing. They exist in small pods, anywhere from 3 to 8 individuals generally. A lot of the pods are families of females and their offspring. Sometimes you'll find bachelor pods of males. But in general, often in the summertime rather, these pods are gathered together in somewhat of a superpod. So there'll be individual little groups together with sometimes hundreds of other groups. And when these superpods are moving past the shoreline in areas that we camp, it may take them more than an hour of steadily looking out and seeing narwhal after narwhal. If you sit there for an hour, you will count hundreds of narwhal going by. And they talk to each other. So this is a recording of what it sounds like when narwhal are sitting. It would be like going to Starbucks and sitting and talking to your friends. Oops. Try that again. So a wide variety of sounds. They have whistles, they have clicks, they have sort of groaning, snoring noises. Okay, now my slide doesn't want to advance. Okay, well, this is waking up again. We're talking about the narwhal year. Once the end of the summer arrives, they start moving out of the fjords, and what they're doing is they're moving back out into open water. Those fjords will freeze absolutely solid in the wintertime. And those narwhal need to move away from shore somewhere where they can safely breathe. So they're moving out into deep water, and what they're looking for are areas called polynyas. Polynyas are areas of open water that stay open all year because of currents and upwellings where ice doesn't form. And again, if you're a narwhal or any air-breathing animal that lives in the high Arctic marine environment, it's really important that you maintain that access to breathing and to air. So they're moving out into the deep water, out into Davis Strait, north of Baffin Island, so between Baffin Island and Greenland, to spend the winter there. So they'll be in the polynyas and also what are called leads or cracks between the sea ice. Occasionally, you will have animals that get caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, what happens to an air-breathing animal when the ice starts to form around them. It's not, I can't even escape. Like it's not. Oh, I see on this thing. There we go. So fall migration, as we were talking about, out to the deep water. and then winters in these leads and polynyas. So this picture of the narwhal on your left is a small pod in a large lead between two ice flows. And you can see the picture on the right. This is actually summer ice, but the amount of ice that can sometimes be, that picture probably represents a couple of kilometers across the water near the shore of Cornwallis Island, and just the amount of ice that can be there. So we mentioned earlier the research that we conduct in the summertime. We're there in the summertime for a couple of reasons. It's warmer, it's light, and there's not as much ice around, although certainly there can be quite a bit of ice that gets in the way of our work. Logistics for getting up there, you can see this. Sometimes you go to catch your flight and there's just a little handwritten sign that says, Canadian North is delayed due to weather. Doesn't say for how long or when the plane might arrive, and then you just sit and wait. Also, when we go up there, this is not lightweight camping. There's a huge amount of gear that needs to be shipped into these camps. We have 2 Zodiac boats with motors. We have nets. We have enough food for usually between 10 and 15 people for 2 to 3 weeks. We have a lot of equipment for the research that goes on. And so there's several plane loads of equipment, or boat loads, depending how we're getting into camp to move. Often we're using a small plane called a twin otter, and these large wheels on it, these are called tundra wheels. If you've never flown into the Arctic, one of the first surprises is once you get north of Iqaluit, all of the commercial airstrips are gravel, so that's a little alarming sometimes when you're coming down for the first time. And then when we get in these twin otters, they will land on small commercial airstrips, but they also will land on the tundra or on a beach. So inside the plane, this is actually a fairly lightly loaded plane. Often the load goes up to the ceiling, and sometimes you're actually sitting behind or beside a 40-gallon barrel of Jet B fuel or diesel, which is always a little disconcerting. So you can see the Twin Otter here sitting on a beach on Baffin Island, a place called Kakiak Point, kind of sitting where he landed on the beach. And flying these low-level flights in the Arctic are just an incredible way, a very privileged way of seeing some of the countryside up there. So this is one of the fjords, one of these deep water fjords on Ellesmere Island, where narwhal would be frequenting in the summertime. Takes a huge team. Takes a real family to carry out this research, and we have both Northern Canadian and Southern Canadian representatives. We have generally a co-captain who is an Inuk, and a co-captain, Mr. Jack Orr, that I've worked with for many years from the south. So they together run the research camp, and then we have a number of different experts, people who are expert in whale handling, sometimes from the Vancouver Aquarium who come and help us, Mr. Clint Wright. We have people who work with critter cams to put cameras on narwhal so we can see what life looks like from the point of view of a narwhal. Veterinarians, biologists, again, a huge group of people. And these are quite remote camps. You can see way in the distance, little set of tents on the beach there, and there's a close-up of those tents on August 23rd after a snowstorm. This was our camp this year on Starnes Fjord in Ellesmere, and this is a willow tree. It's about 3 inches tall in its fall foliage. So again, in early August, we're already well into the autumn in the Arctic. Lots of other visitors come into camp. We do need to be very careful of polar bears when we're in the Arctic, and often Arctic foxes, if they know you're around, they will be looking for scraps often. We keep a 24-hour-a-day watch for polar bears, and occasionally they do. Occasionally they do come close to camp, and so there's various ways. Generally yelling is enough to have them turn around and go in the opposite direction. I've seen lots of polar bears over the years. We've never had acute trouble with them, but certainly it's something that you have a great respect for and watch for all the time. So while we're there, how do we get our hands on a narwhal to handle it? We set a net, and so this is one of the Zodiacs out on the water. You'll see some little floats out behind the boat. being set to hold the net in the water. And when it's set, it's a little bit hard to see, there will be a line of several floats across the top of the water with about 10 meters of net that drapes down from that. And once the net is in the water, then it's 24 hours a day someone is watching that net all the time. If a narwhal entangles in the net, what will happen is some of those floats will go underwater, and we respond immediately. So everybody sleeps very, very lightly. The call that goes out is whale in the net, and it's repeated again and again by whoever hears it. Our response time to be out to a whale, bring them up to the surface, and get them to the shore is usually under 5 minutes. So it's a very rapid response. But when you're in the research camp, this is what you do a lot of the day and a lot of the night is just watch. You're just watching that net. And this is what you're watching for. So the net is to your right. And this is what you might see, if you're lucky, is a narwhal heading towards the net. Sometimes you see nothing, and those boys just go underwater. So the zodiacs are in the water all the time, waiting for that potential of a whale getting entangled in the net. And then, as I said, the response is immediate to go out and collect the whale. So here you can see a little bit of a splash out by the boat, and that is the boat crews pulling the whale to the surface. There are people left on shore who then pull the net and the boats into shore, and then the whale is restrained. So this is a fairly small animal. It's gray with white mottling, so a young animal being restrained and ready for research activities. Most of the time, once the whales are at the shore, we bring their tail into the shore side. They are very placid and quiet, and what I'm doing is a physical exam to ensure that whale is healthy. I'll take a blowhole culture. I'll take some blood samples. I'll show you a picture on the next slide. The rest of the crew is holding the whale and affixing one of these satellite transmitters. This will stay on the whale for about a year and sends a signal to a satellite that gives locations of where that whale has gone. The blood sample is collected from the base of the tail. You can just see there the syringe filling with blood. So we're looking at the physiological effects of the handling on the whale and making sure that they are being handled and managing that physiologically. And then the whale is released. It's generally walked out to a little bit deeper water and released. So you can see this is quite a large and old male. When he comes to the surface a little bit, you can see how white he is. And he is struggling more than the average whale, but he's being moved out to deeper water. And you'll just see on the left of the screen a buoy coming in. We're just trying to get him out past that buoy and anchor rope to make sure that he doesn't entangle. In terms of results, so again, we're working, in this case, on the northwest end of Baffin Island. And here's a more close-up map that shows you some of the tag returns. So each number is the number of a tag on a whale, and each of the red dots and the lines between shows areas where whales have been seen and the tracks that they have been swimming. So this is in the late summer. They're still in the deep water fjord part of their year, shortly to move out into deeper water offshore. One of the things that's very important about this work is that our narwhal are a shared resource with Greenland. Or over the years, we haven't been sure how loyal Canadian narwhal are to coming back to the Canadian side, and Greenland narwhal are to going back to the Greenland side from their wintering grounds in the middle of Davis Strait. It turns out, we believe, that in general, whales that come from Canada come back to Canada. So they're not really in danger of straggling over to the Greenland side and being hunted on both sides of that strait. So one of the things that everybody is interested in with narwhal, and a lot of things that are happening in the Arctic, is what is happening with the changes that are going on with climate change. This slide on your left, the white area shows the summer ice extent in 2007. The yellow line around that shows the median ice extent between 1979 and 2000. So you can see how much less ice we have in the summertime. For whatever reasons that is happening, it is something that's being observed annually in the Arctic. A huge amount less ice in the summer, which translates to later freezing, earlier thawing in the spring. Lots and lots of changes happening at a physical level in the ocean with that ice melt. We've got more fresh water because more of the ice has melted, different stratification. You can see the sort of domino effect here of many, many differences occurring in the ocean environment that the whales live in. And one thing, we're all concerned about the health of the narwhal and narwhal populations. We need to not forget about the knowledge that the Inuit and their long, long relationship with the narwhal can bring to the table. I'm medically trained, and it's very quick to go to, this animal has a disease, and that's a problem. This funny pink picture is actually what narwhal lung looks like under the microscope. But the brown material in there is a little parasite. And so immediately I would think, parasite, that's a bad thing. They also have little parasites inside their ear. And a friend of mine, Japadi Akiaguk, asked me, and laughing at me a couple of summers ago, why I thought those worms were there. So they're little worms that live inside their ear. And that was an odd question. Why are they there? I would think, what are they doing there? How are they harming the animal? But why are they there? And I had to admit that I didn't really know. And he said, they're there to remind the narwhal to pay attention. Narwhal live in an area where there's a lot of dangers. There's polar bears, there's ice, there's Greenland shark, there's killer whales. They can't stop paying attention. And if they do, the little worm wiggles and reminds them that they have to pay attention to stay safe. It's a very different way of looking at something, and it challenges our paradigm, I think, in a really good way. Maybe those worms aren't a bad thing for the narwhal at all. But we are concerned about their health. They are one of the species we believe will be most sensitive to climate change because they are very specialized. They are very loyal to a particular habitat, and they live in a very narrow range of habitat. Lots of changes in their world. Killer whales, now you can see that big dorsal fin that comes out of the water. These do not do well in a nice habitat, but they're spending more and more time in the Arctic, and they actively hunt killer narwhal. They're very effective narwhal predators. So more predation. We've got the potential for new diseases being introduced as things like pilot whales, which live off Newfoundland, move further north because they can, because there's not enough ice. They carry a disease that narwhal have never been exposed to. Changing ice phenology. So what happens when there's not an ice edge for narwhal to feed at? Entrapments. The Inuit have a word for this, siku jaus simajut, and that just means those entrapped in the ice. So sometimes in the wintertime, narwhal are in the wrong place at the wrong time. This, we believe, is happening more often than it used to. It's happened for a long time, but it may be happening more as the ice changes and they're not able to predict. And when they're trapped in the ice and those ice holes freeze over, the narwhal will die. So generally, if it's near an Inuit community, they will go and do a humane hunt and pull them out. So again, we mentioned many changes in their environment, things that are happening to the algae, to the zooplankton, to the fish that narwhal rely on, and whether this will be a challenge for them in the future. We just don't know yet. Shipping. Without that ice, there will be many, many more boats coming through the Arctic. And narwhal are very sensitive to sound. So we're going from a handful of ships every year to, within the next 20 years, hundreds and hundreds of ships going right through that area where those 70,000 narwhal live. Resource extraction. We've got iron ore mines going in on Baffin Island with associated shipping. We have seismic exploration for oil on the ocean bottom, again using very loud sound. And we have fisheries starting up in the Arctic. A great thing for the Inuit, but potentially another thing that may challenge narwhal. Hunting pressure. While the hunt is very carefully controlled, it's done in a different manner now with rifles and boats. So are the narwhal going to experience stress? Is it going to be a big problem for them? So we are looking for changes over time, ways of monitoring what's happening to narwhal. We can look at, interestingly, skin microbiomes, the bacteria on their skin, and whether that has changed over time in response to possibly poorer health. We know that this works in humpback whales, and we're going to check to see if it works in narwhal. How much stress hormone is stored in their blubber. We know in beluga that have health challenges, the levels of stress hormone go up. So is that something we can use with narwhal to see if changes are happening? and also stress-related proteins in their skin, something we can measure. It's been used in dolphins, and again, can be applied to narwhal to see if over the last 30 years, the amount of stress they are experiencing is going up. So we're looking for changes, and what we're hoping for is resilience, that the narwhal, even though they are sensitive, are going to be resilient to the changes coming to their environment, and that the Inuit will be able to look forward to them returning year over year in the coming centuries. Huge amount of acknowledgements. There's many, many people, as you can see, that I have worked with over the years. And thank you to the organizations that support and fund this work. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Sandie. We have a live science demo happening in here shortly, but we do have time if we could take 1 or 2 questions. Is there any questions from the audience? I'll just check our online audience. That seemed to have covered off all of their questions as well. Thank you very much, Sandie. That was a very fascinating talk, especially putting together the legend of the unicorn with a remarkable animal that dwells in Canada's Arctic. Again, if you're interested in this course and the other talks that are a part of it, I have some flyers about it down here at the front. You can come and ask me. And thank you again to Dr. Sandie Black for joining us today.